Next week, we are lucky to have Murche giving a talk on Monday on his research. He's one of the CSL postdocs, and we'll be talking about innovation, not elimination, and carbon technologies. And then on October 22nd, we'll have Noah Zucker here from, I was going to say the London School of Economics, but he's no longer there. He's at Princeton University, also talking about climate change and labor markets, actually. And so please, take note of those events in the future. But today, we are lucky enough to have Lily Hsueh, whose work on economics and climate change is resulted in this brand new book that I now have a copy of that I can display. So we're going to hear more about it in just a moment. She is an economist by training, environmental economist by training, who worked at the Federal Reserve and is now in a school of public policy. So she has, on some level, transcended the realm of pure economics, and we are delighted to have her here. Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you so much, Jeff, for the very generous introduction. So I'm delighted to be here to share with you my new book, Corporations at Climate Crossroads. And in this book, I really try to bring together economics, of course, but political science and management, essentially the different traditional disciplines that are shaping climate policy today. And I'm delighted that, I'm standing on shoulders of giants, and several of these leaders have endorsed the book. So by way of motivation, as you all know, 2024 was the hottest year on record. And this year, 2025, is the second hottest year on record, not quite beating last year. Last year was about 1.2 to 1.3 degrees Celsius above the 20th century average baseline. And as we know, the Paris Agreement stated long-term objective in maintaining really a global temperature rise would be ideally not above 1.5 degrees Celsius. What we know is that the share of global carbon dioxide due to fossil fuel burning is been represented by global businesses, which represents about 70% of annual industrial emissions, and about 100 producers of fossil fuel producers are indeed responsible. So that's on the kind of physical climate side. Juxtapose that with political, economic realities. We know that corporate climate disclosures have been in the news. In 2023, California declared that there will be mandatory climate disclosure rules. And of course, they're not the first one to be stipulating these rules. There's been disclosure rules in the UK, EU, New Zealand, India, Singapore, even City of Hong Kong, and the US SEC proposed rules too, which we know are on hold. And interestingly, as many of you know, companies worldwide have been preparing for mandatory disclosure rules and more for years now. And here you see the logos of global businesses across sectors. So in this book, my main questions are, so what are some of the firm level and political economy factors, so both the bottom up and top down drivers of corporate behavior and performance on climate change? I also asked, do firms that participate in voluntary climate action emit less carbon emissions? So really a question about do they actually work, these pledges and that firms are making? And what about the interactions? How are kind of firm vis-a-vis regulations, vis-a-vis global governance, and how do they vary across sectors and in developed and developing countries? So let me tell you a little bit about the book's mixed methods. So I try to bring together both the large and quantitative analysis. And I follow global businesses, the Global 500, and the S&P 500 firms' climate mitigation and performance for about a decade, 2011 to 2020, although I have newer data as well. I create a global sustainable business climate action database with, again, both the firm level data as well as industry sector, country level data, and global governance data. I answer some questions about causal inference, like really trying to make the link between what's on the left-hand side with what's on the right-hand side, and I do that through quasi-experiments and also attempting to get at what economists would say are intensive and extensive measures. So, or this idea of so there's a lot of participation, but to what extent are the efforts and the outcomes actually there? But I do more than that. I also am have been a participant observer at these large industry-initiated conferences, UN Global Compact meetings, summits. There are specialized workshops for emerging leaders at the corporate level, and I've also interviewed firm leaders, global governance leaders, and regulators as well. And I do some illustrative case studies to get at some of the causal mechanisms, to tell some stories across different firms as well. So as I said at the beginning of my talk, that I'm really kind of bringing together several kind of important literatures. And let me start off with kind of at the firm level. So I reach into the private provisions of public goods literature, also the public policy literature, where there has been a lot of research on decentralized governance approaches, where firms are profit maximizers, but they're profit maximizers with a broader set of preferences and calculations, where they take into account private politics and public politics. And the idea is, it's because there's imperfect information. There's asymmetric information and between firms, regulators, and stakeholders. And firms engage in self-regulation as a way to deflect these real costs. And then I also reach into the private authority, transnational climate governance literature, where the unit of analysis is more oftentimes at the domestic or global level, so the country level, the global level. And this is a literature that many of you are in, and here, this idea of the collective action problem, how do we bring, in recent decade, how do we bring back the state in domestic politics when we think about the role of climate actors, whether it's private sector actors or global governance institutions. And then more recent literature too, and on distributive conflict lens, looking at fossil fuel assets and the green assets and their relationships, which Jennifer Hayden's work on international organizations, opening up the black box of that. I open up the black box of the firm, and Jeff Cohen, your recent work with Jessica Green, again, I'm looking at the distributive conflict lens. And, so this rise of private regulation in this really kind of complex networks of various actors with firms rising as governors and delegation of public to private authority. So in this book, I try to attempt to then link that to the firm level and to what managers within firms are doing. And so opening up the black box of the firm and making those links, interactions, and I try to, as much as I can, measure it or tell some rich stories about these interactions, how then that is driving what's happening on the ground. So let me open the black box of the firm, looking at managerial agency. And here I reach into the organizational behavior managerial studies, where recent literature have spoken about managers as crucial kind of critical actors where they're facilitating incentives and coordination, and they're able to coordinate complementary capabilities and shape narratives. And what they do is they attract climate neutral and climate conscious employees, and through essentially through the labor market, they are bringing in employees who care about what the firms are doing in terms of climate. And then they then align the beliefs of the employees with that of the firm. And within the firm, they form governing coalitions. And I will tell a couple of stories toward the end of the talk where that is indeed happening at companies like Adidas and even more traditional tech companies like Intel. And so then these managers help firms become carriers of identity and reputation, and they confer even benefits to employees that's beyond wages. And in fact, there are recent studies coming out of Sweden where they're showing that employees who are engaged in companies that have more of a sustainability focus, they're willing in some instances even to accept a little bit less wage because of that reputational benefit that they're garnering. But again, my understanding of firms is they're rational, but they're bound to lead rational. And so, in fact, they are taking into account both the costs of private and public politics, but also realizing what this new generation of employees are wanting and seeing into the future. And in looking at the data, what we see is that the role of senior level, executive level managers or chief sustainability officers have grown over time in the decade that I follow these global businesses. Of course, developed countries are growing faster than developing countries, but India and Brazil are kind of following along what the developed country firms are doing. And then in terms of China and Russia, corporate international businesses there, while they're in line with developing countries, maybe a little below, there's kind of sharper trends going on where essentially global businesses around the world are finding it that it's increasingly important to hire and to invest in corporate management. Dedicated to climate mitigation and adaptation as well. Here, I just wanted to draw your attention to just the highlighted. In 2011, across sectors, we're seeing that global businesses are adopting climate change managers by 54%. By 2020, it is more than 3/4 of global businesses are very much in tune in hiring these corporate sustainability officers, and that is true across sectors. So in chapter 2 of my book, I develop a multi-level governance framework on climate change, and it's a political economic framework where I adapt Elinor Ostrom's nested structural institutions, but I inverted. So I have here at the bottom the corporate governance level or the operational level. Then the second level is a collective choice or regulatory governance. That's where regulation and even private standards are situated. And also at the very top is our global governance or the constitutional level. And that's where you have these global best practices and standards and norms. And in my book, I form these propositions with which I later test about corporate and regulatory interactions, as well as corporate and global governance interactions. And then I have a set of propositions where I look at the fact that there's some conditioning effects here where learning and norming are attenuated by regulatory pressures at the global level. Let me go through each one of them carefully. So in terms of corporate and regulatory interactions, I adopt this idea of bargaining under the shadow of the law in international relations literature, where, and the way I adapt it is that firm A, they offers a deal to government B's, and it offers the deal of self-regulation, and it has to be greater or equal than government B's outside offer or the expected utility of regulation. And in the book, I go into more detail, but the bottom line is that the stronger the threat of regulation, the more credible or higher quality will be firm A's self-regulation. And in this way, managers are what I called regulation brokers. So if regulatory pressure is high and the marginal cost of self-regulation is low, managers will hasten efforts to signal firms' ability to internalize externalities, earn goodwill, and liabilities. So there really is, in fact, this really rational response, even as within the firm, companies or managers are, forming those political coalitions and also shaping narratives. And that the corporate and global interaction, in terms of corporate and global interactions, firms view global governance as a harbinger of future regulations. And it's so for that reason, even though it's a lesser form of regulatory pressure, it is something to be reckoned with, and through active engagement. And so managers are norm brokers. What they do is they join these epistemic communities where they really help to define problems and identify solutions and assess outcomes. And I saw this on the ground happening at these green biz, these sustainability conferences run by businesses, where indeed they are engaging actively with global governance actors. And then, so they then help to translate, they bring home those global best practices and norms and, to their specific context, though. And then they try and, and they test them and work with them, and they eventually will become market norms or even rule of law, and they know this. So regulation and global governance are both something that firms and managers within firms are readily engaging with. And this is not, and I'm not talking about corporate lobbying, and that's something separate. And I make that clear in my book. Is that there's been a lot of very interesting and fascinating books on corporate lobbying and regulatory capture, but this is another area within the firm that's very active, and we're seeing these not lobbying, but these active engagement in other ways. With all that said, and global governance institutions are sites of norming and learning, but what firms are ultimately learning, and it is attenuated by regulatory pressure. So regulation will oftentimes serve as a baseline when push comes to shove. At the same, so there is this this kind of conditioning effect as well that regulation and governance and global governance the interaction affects. So this side, like right here, what I do in the book is I then link that to outcomes. First, to outputs. So whether firms are engaged in carbon disclosure, are they adopting emissions reduction targets, are they setting an internal price on carbon? And are they doing that with a lot of effort, so at high levels or low levels or intensity of participation? And ultimately, I link that to performance or outcomes and looking at firms' carbon emissions and carbon emissions intensity. What I say is that firms engage in high effort. They will, make these pledges. But if they will engage in higher efforts when there is regulatory pressure, holding constant private politics and of course, firm size and all the other important factors, and they will engage with less effort if they are facing less regulatory pressure, and of course, less pressure coming from globally as well. So I am going to now then spend the next 15 minutes or so talking about my empirical application, and I'm happy to answer questions at the Q&A with regarding kind of more the theory and the foundations. But let me go ahead and share some of my empirical applications. And I am focused on corporate climate disclosures, in part because that's what companies have been engaged in for nearly 20 years now. Again, as I showed you earlier, they've been preparing for mandatory disclosure rules and more, with adopting emissions targets and even setting an internal price on carbon. And they've been doing that through the Carbon Disclosure Project, now called the CDP. CDP was founded, an NGO, global NGO, founded in 2000, and on behalf of institutional investors, they survey companies annually about their governance, about their strategy, risk management, whether they have emissions targets, even asking firms to report their entity-wide carbon emissions. What the CDP does, and they have done this for many years now, is that they grade firms on low to high levels of climate disclosure. And so I exploit this in my empirical analysis. So a grade D is, it's a level, the grade D, it's just for basic carbon transparency, whether a firm has responded to a survey or not. And you get, increasingly higher grades all the way to A if you are able to show that you, in fact, have a third-party audit on your Scope 1, Scope 2 emissions. And if you report your Scope 3 emissions, you get additional points as well. And let me also say a few words about the main case of global governance. So I follow the United Nations Global Compact. It is a low-cost, low-entry cost institution, and it's the world's largest corporate citizenship global governance institution. And I chose that because it is the largest IGO, and many corporate members and stakeholders from over 167 countries are part of it. And firms join voluntarily, and they just need to communicate their progress in carrying out UNGC's 10 principles. There is no monitoring or sanctions for non-adherence. And so, as you can imagine, there's a lot of variations, the extent to which firms are actually being actively involved, or and so the way I see this particular case is that it's a lower bound test for validity of my multi-level political economic framework. There are many institutional venues for learning and norming, in particular two. The first one is the UN Global Compact's their local networks. And these are a country level local networks where at the country level, companies join, and where they're actually, in fact, being very, very engaged what's happening at the global level, but also what is happening at the local regulation level as well. The UN Global Compact Academy, however, it's an online academy where companies around the world, regardless of your locale, can learn about the latest and global best practices or norms. So for example, in the past 5 years or so, there's been a lot of these special workshops on how to set an internal price on carbon. And so this is a venue where then global firms around the world can participate, while the local networks is very much on the ground. How do we enhance local regulation, but at the same time adhere to local regulation? Of course, this group know about Scope 1 and Scope 2 and Scope 3 emissions. Scope 1 and Scope 2 are more direct to the company. Scope 2 is firms' purchases of power, right? And Scope 3 is the supply chain emissions. And I want to show you some results of where I look at sustainability outputs. So these are either the pledges or the participation of companies in these in climate action. So in this part of the book, I follow companies in a panel data, and I have data from 2011 to 2015, and then also to 2020 as well, where I'm following nearly 700 Fortune Global 500 companies, and I have both their firm level and then data coming from the annual surveys of CDP, and also have firm level data from LSEG data analytics from Bloomberg, country level data, World Bank, Freedom House, International Environmental Agreements database, also environmental performance indexes as well. And so, as I showed earlier, and in many of these empirical analysis, I'm looking at these discrete continuous modeling, and I'm not going into the technical details, but what I want to say about it is that the reason I am looking at both using these discrete continuous analysis and different models where I triangulate to make sure that they indeed cohere is the fact that, again, companies are making these 0-1 binary decisions about participation, but are they actually indeed putting in the effort? And so for that, I have that second stage modeling of looking at the level of disclosure. And then a look at the variables. I want to point out at the firm level, I have data from the CDP where we're talking about these different managerial levels, but I have data for kind of top line managers or executive level officers. I have information about targets, membership of firms in global governance institutions, and notably the UN Global Compact. At the country level, let me say a few words about how I measure regulatory stringency. I have four different measures. One is the IEA, the international agreements, ratifications by countries at the country level, and then I do robustness checks where I use the environmental performance index from Yale, and also LSE have collection of climate change laws, legislations, and so I also have counts of those, and also kind of a more detailed kind of quality or the extent to which some of these rules are stringent versus less stringent, and so these are all various measures of regulatory stringency. So the results that I will show you are robust to these different measures. And of course, I have these cross-level interactions where I am looking at firm vis-a-vis regulation and firm vis-a-vis global governance. So my first set of results that I want to show you, this is the interactions between corporate and regulation. So what you want to see here, the first, basically three results that I want to highlight. Firms' participation and effort in voluntary carbon disclosure are greater with than without managerial agency at all levels of regulatory stringency. And you can see regulatory stringency from 1 to 4. And as regulatory stringency increases, firm possessing a manager, so the chief sustainability officers, or an emissions target, are more likely to participate and disclose at higher levels. So both the extensive and intensive margins. And then another result I want to highlight is that without the facilitating corporate management structure, though, strong regulatory institutions alone do not lead to greater participation or effort in voluntary carbon disclosure. And then now looking at the corporate and global interactions. So firms that have installed a manager are more likely to disclose carbon than firms without a manager. And this is regardless whether they are part of the Global Compact as a member or not. And then with that said, though, the firms that have installed a manager and have joined the global compact have a near perfect chance of disclosure. So that's a very kind of strong interaction effect there. And when a firm possesses both a target and UNGC membership, what we see is that their carbon disclosure score is close to 90 points, and that's about 20% higher than if firms did not adopt this kind of carbon management target, or if they did not join the UNGC. So again, that interaction of corporate and global is quite strong and confirmed. And then this is in chapter 6. I have analysis where I make I make the point and show that there is this productive interplay between global governance and regulation. But global governance, although there's the pressures from global governance, from these global norms, amplify, but they don't substitute for regulation. And so one of the results is that for a 1% increase in regulatory stringency, the odds of adoption of emissions target is 1.2 times higher for firms that have joined the UNGC Global Compact than non-members. The odds are a little higher for firms' adoption of a little bit costlier corporate management tools, where they are adopting both a carbon price as well as emissions target, and this is this is where regulatory stringency is increasing marginally. So again, there is this kind of this interplay, but also conditioning effect of global governance pressures. Another result I find is that regulatory stringency appears to matter more in developing countries, with companies, global businesses, and again, these are the world's largest companies. Some of them, of course, based in emerging markets or developing countries. Where what I show here, I have the marginal effects of regulatory stringency on a carbon disclosure score. So the efforts that companies are putting in is that when global businesses when they're based in a developing country, as regulation increases, they're also more likely to participate and do so at higher degrees. I highlight and tell the story of European-based companies where, Europe's companies are the climate leaders, and this is true across a lot of metrics where I have both outcomes, where we're looking at reductions of core emissions intensity over a 5-year time, as well as the number of times they've been on these international kind of rankings of the Corporate Knights Global 100 rankings, whether it's regarding their managers, all the different various sustainability outputs, their participation in global governance, as well as their ESG, environmental social governance scores. And so indeed, the EU, UK, Norway, Switzerland firms lead on climate. And of course, we know it is where regulatory stringency is stronger comparatively across the globe on climate. So now I want to turn to taking a look at sustainability outcomes. I asked a question in Chapter 7 of my book. Do firms that participate in voluntary carbon disclosure, in fact, actually emit less carbon emissions? What I'm going to show you in the next couple of slides, or several slides, is I'm going to both show you some quantitative results, but I also will give a little bit more context with some stories as well. But first, in the U.S. case, this is where I exploit a natural experiment or a quasi, and I utilize quasi experiments. Is that here I show you the timeline of failed climate change proposals in the U.S. Congress, dating back to over nearly 2 decades, where there's in the federal government, in terms of the U.S. Congress, there were many failed proposals, and what had shown the most promise, in fact, was actually the Obama era's EPA's introduction of the Clean Power Plan. And at that time, of course, we know, even though now it's being challenged, that the EPA's own studies had shown that greenhouse gas emissions endangered public health. Right, this is under challenge right now, and also the Supreme Court made a clear finding that the Clean Air Act would encompass the greenhouse gas emissions. And so at that time, the CPP really emerged as something that was credible, of course, to the power sector where the power plants were being targeted, but at the same time, it was kind of across the board as well, where firms were feeling the pinch and that there is going to be regulation to come. Of course, it got challenged in the courts and did not eventually come to pass, but that was an important set of regulation, a set of kind of bureaucratically driven regulations. And so I have a quasi-experimental research design here. I won't, again, go into the details, but I have an identification strategy where I am interacting the CPP with with the target of the greenhouse gas intensive sectors, and exploiting also variations of managerial agency within these firms as well, and using some standard quasi-experimental approach of triple differences estimators, embedded again in my discrete continuous modeling approach. Where again, I am really trying to get at both the extensive and intensive margins. And here are some of the variables. I'm happy to talk about the technical details during the Q&A. And this is where I take into account how the CDP grades firms, again, for either leadership, management, awareness, or just carbon transparency, or responding to their annual survey. One thing I would point out is that for the CDP, leadership does not mean environmental performance. So in terms of participation in the CDP, what we see is that without a manager, and then I have here, it's not super clear, but I show the Clean Power, where the Clean Power Plan it took place in that kind of between the 2014 to 2015 period, and you do see the kind of the how the trends have changed with respect to firms with no manager and with manager and their participation in the CDP. And that's and with the greenhouse gas intensive firms versus the consumer oriented or non-greenhouse gas intensive firms. And in terms of their carbon disclosure scores or the level of effort, you're also seeing that that those with managers and without managers are responding quite differently, and how they responded before and after the introduction of the Clean Power Plan by the EPA. So let me start with the good news. The good news is that as a disclosing firm increases in size, it does reduce carbon emissions intensity. And here I'm measuring it by carbon emissions on a per employee basis. And in the book, I also look at carbon emissions on a kind of per dollar basis or by with respect to revenues. And so that's good news. Their participation in carbon disclosure have allowed them to, at the very least, correlate with reductions in carbon emissions intensity. And this is the S&P 500 companies, and that change, a lot of it is driven by what's happening with the greenhouse gas intensive firms, both in the power sector as well as energy sectors as well. And there were some low-hanging fruits, because what we're seeing here is that the firms that just their participation alone, so they're answering these annual climate change surveys, but by mere participation, there is this correlation with reduced emissions intensity. And in the book, I highlight this at the global level, so beyond the S&P 500, the Oil and Gas Climate Initiative Collaborative, where it is the 12 largest producers, oil and gas producers. They make up about 30% of world production of oil and gas. They're engaged in carbon capture, utilization and storage, and methane emissions reduction and whatnot. From 2011 to 2020, Norway's Equinor ranked among the global 100 for clean capitalism 7 times, and 6 out of the 12 of these largest producers, which include Chevron to BP, ExxonMobil, they have made it even to the sustainable capitalism list at least once. What is true is that none of them have achieved sustained reduced carbon emissions intensity within a 5-year period. But compared to the greenhouse gas intensive sector as a whole globally, they have reduced their entity-wide emissions within the 10-year period that I was observing these companies. Now to some interesting findings about some greenwashing. So for consumer-oriented firms, I do find that they are pledging, and they're doing quite a bit, and they're earning A and B from letters or grades A and B from the CDP. But there's some perverse effects with them, in fact, increasing their entity-wide emissions. So these are kind of marginal effects. And what we know is that being on the CDP's A list, though, do not exempt them from greenwashing. So companies like Walmart, Target, Nike, they all are within the A and B range of the CDP. And many of them actually have been part of the industry-led Cascel, and it was formerly the Sustainable Apparel Coalition. Some of you might remember them as the former name, and which it has been controversial, where they have portrayed petroleum-based synthetics as the most sustainable choice above natural fibers in an index called the Higgs Index, which is still in use within the supply chain, the apparel industry, trying to measure their firm's social and environmental footprint. And the Walmart itself has been sued by the US FTC over products of where it claimed that it was eco-friendly, but in fact was not as eco-friendly. So from what you're hearing what you're seeing in the news, or the controversies about greenwashing, we are seeing a lot of that in the apparel sector. And but at the same time, as I showed you earlier, it does seem across the global businesses, there is reduced carbon emissions intensity, which is good news. I want to kind of end my talk today with 2 case studies that I want to share with you, and to kind of highlight some of the important kind of managerial and organizational level factors, the corporate and regulation level interactions, and the corporate global interactions. So Intel has been in the news of about not doing well and not making profits lately. It has actually, in fact, done a lot in the past couple of decades. It had early in leadership buy-in. Initially, it was really the engineering mindset where they focused on energy efficiency. And but they were able to kind of pivot what they were doing in terms of their copy exactly in their computing to pivot, and also what they were doing in green sustainable chemistry into climate. After controversies around what they were doing kind of with toxic chemicals, they were very engaged in water conservation and green chemistry, and they pivoted that into climate action. And they started their ESG-like reporting since the 90s, the mid-90s. And post the Paris Agreement, they've been actively engaged with investors, customers, and also really kind of concerned with their culture, the talent pool, and again, what I will show later in the next slide about what's happening in Adidas is that a lot of what companies are doing with respect to corporate social responsibility around climate are now in the HR or workforce development kind of parts of their companies because of this realizing that it is not just something that should be a concern of manufacturing or concern of just one part of the firm, but really kind of more holistically. And for Intel, they developed a handprint approach where it's this idea that global customers cannot reduce carbon footprints worldwide, including customers like Microsoft, without Intel's computing power. And up until July of this year, they were very engaged in kind of EU's Good Green Deal and CHIPS Act and building out their manufacturing footprints in the EU and beyond. And the global face-to-face is something that they've adopted within their company, where they're meeting with offices around the world, are really engaged with kind of the local regulatory compliance or beyond compliance. And at the global level, they've been involved in threading their framework, their own climate framework with that of the UN Sustainability Development Goals. And this is true with Adidas as well, where they really embrace this idea of owning the game with sustainable materials. And again, from the head start, their green company, which is essentially their corporate social responsibility arm, was sponsored by Adidas's chief executive office from the very, since the mid 2000s. And again, it has also now become part of the global place and governance arm of the company. It's true across a lot of international companies. And on their since 2015, they've focused on tracking and reporting of targets and outcomes, and also within companies itself, looking at how to bring together managers and employees with incentives for employees and managerial units to be involved in sustainability projects. And they, of course, they're in the EU and Germany, and so facing a lot more regulatory pressures, and they're a founding member of many global governance collaborations. I'm running out of time, so let me just leave with you several main takeaways. Is that the internal firm dynamics and the regulatory governance and global governance have been examined in terms of these various interactions. And so amid climate uncertainty, I argue that effective corporate responses really emerge from a combination of having strong managerial leadership, where they are using smartly complementary capabilities, and they're engaging proactively with regulation and global governance, aside from what they already are doing in terms of lobbying and whatnot. So these are my main takeaways in my book. Thank you so much.
anyone to speak up, and we have a microphone, so if we could just use that, that would be perfect. I see one in the back. Let's start there.
Thank you so much for your talk.
Thank you.
Would you be kind enough to let me, I guess, in the audience know, what do you mean by manager? Or do
Yes.
these manager positions have various job titles? And then secondly, are these managers acting alone as far as making a decision, or they're working in coordination with the CEO and with the stockholders?
Yeah, thank you so much for your question. So the managers I'm referring to and the ones that are having the impact that I am describing are part of the Chief Sustainability Office, or they're part of the governing board of the companies. In one of my chapters, I look at kind of these lower level managerial positions, and they tend to have less of an effect, as one might imagine, as one could imagine. And these, but at the kind of more executive level, however, what they're doing is they are building these political coalitions inside firms with employees as well as executive officers and within their board of directors as well. Thanks.
Thank you so much. I know that you.
You can say your name as well.
Yes, sorry. My name is Taryn. I'm an undergraduate student here. I know that you said you've been looking at data from 2011, 2020,
Yeah.
and you have some data since then. Have you seen anything big change since 2020 was the pandemic, and the way that we look at sustainability and climate has changed a lot, even with new businesses coming forward, utilizing artificial intelligence and stuff like that? Are they implementing these kinds of things from the start as new businesses start off, or are they slowly starting to adopt it? How's that changed since
Yeah.
the data that you gathered?
Yeah, thank you so much. Yes. So what we're seeing now is that from the get-go, you will have to have these kind of managerial capabilities within your company. So you will have to hire these executive level managers, and the board of directors oftentimes already have a climate related committee. They will have, and from the get-go, they will have these adopt these emissions targets, and even setting an internal carbon price on carbon. And so what we're seeing is that there's this trend that has grown over time, and now it's ubiquitous. So it's all over, and they were initially just emerging global best practices, but now they are the existing best practices, and there will be new ones as you said, with AI adoption and technology being embedded in how carbon is being managed.
Say your name, please.
Mark Blythe, Brown University. If regulatory pressure is key to
Yeah.
this entire thing, we now live in a world where all those regulatory pressures are going into reverse, and also in Europe. All the firms in your European sample are in easy to decarbonize sectors. Most of them were either consulting or pharma. The one engineering firm makes green tech. I mean, aren't you kind of sampling on the people who it's easy to hire a chief sustainability officer because it's easy to do that? And then there's no actual costs for disclosure. Like, you get a D, nobody cares, right? There's no share price data. It doesn't affect the C-suite. And now that the political winds have changed, they're all happily reversing themselves on this and lobbying on the other side of the curve. Is it just the case that between 2010 and 2020, this seemed to matter, and now states don't like green stuff and it's over?
Thank you for your question and comment. I hear what you're saying. One thing I would say is that I do follow like a universe of these global businesses. So I am seeing those who are doing more and those who are doing less. So my results do include the good actors and the bad actors. So that's one point I would make. And in terms of what's happening right now with the kind of political headwinds, if you will, I think it is more important than ever that there are these various pressure points, right, that can happen. Regulation is important. aside from that, of course, we have the stakeholders, the climate activists, and NGOs. So it's really kind of it does require all hands on deck, which I talk about toward the end of or in the last chapter of my book, and also about how even with respect to regulation, it shouldn't just happen at kind of in a federalist country like republic that we are in, that it's also coming from local and state governments as well. And so multi-level governance is not just multi-level from the federal, national to global, but also coming from these different pressure points within countries itself. And then some sectors, you're right, are doing more than others and maybe easy. And so those are the low-hanging fruits. And in my data, I'm able to see those low-hanging fruits, but I'm also seeing that for the for some harder to reduce emissions firms in those other sectors, or more in carbon intensive sectors, with pressure, whether these are global pressures or regulatory pressures, they will do more. And one more point is that a lot of times it's not even just about regulations on the book. It's actually about what might be to come with the International Justice Court's new ruling, which means that there will be more litigations to come. And if global businesses, for them, it's a long haul. Right, it's not just this next year or the next 2 years. They will, for kind of survival and long term, they will look at what's happening a few years down the line as well, including litigations. Thank you.
Okay, so we are just about at time, but if there was one more question that was bursting to come out, I'd be happy to take it.
Yes.
Make it a quick one, please.
I'm Craig. I'm a grad student in engineering. Have you looked at any comparisons to historical data, like what people did, like when the Clean Air Act came out, or like when they revised the Clean Air Act later in the 80s, to see what they did then versus what they're doing now, and if these changes now even compare to like when these things were like more at the forefront?
So I did not reach back that far. That said, a lot has happened even within this 2011 to 2025. What I do know is that global businesses have essentially, in the 2000s, they were just starting to voluntarily report to the CDP. By now, most, like 75% of the global 500s and 60% of the S&P 500 are reporting to the CDP, and now it's essentially a standard to have quantitative targets and even setting a price on carbon. So these things have grown a lot over time.
Please please join me in thanking Professor Hsueh.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure.